Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. This is a level theme from Final Fantasy X, the best Final Fantasy game. But which level do you think it's for? What does it look like, and what kind of enemies do you fight there? It may seem like a silly question. After all, it's just a piece of music. How could you know what the level looks like without seeing it? And yet, to my ears, this definitely makes me think of cold atmospheres, snowy terrains, and ice monsters, and if you're a gamer, there's a good chance you heard that too. Which, yeah, that's correct. It's the theme for Lake Macalania, a frozen lake where you fight things like snow wolves, ice flans, and even a Wendigo. But how could we tell? Well, I've played the game, and you saw the video title, so we both cheated, but even still, there's something in the music that just feels wintry. But what? It's not surprising that music can evoke non-musical ideas. If you've been around music theory YouTube long enough, you've probably heard someone mention leitmotifs. This is a specific phrase or gesture used in a film score as a musical stand-in for a specific character, place, or idea. Like in Star Wars, the main melody of the Imperial March quickly became the leitmotif for Darth Vader, so when you hear that same melody in a new context, you know the music is talking about him. It's a classic technique dating back to 19th century opera, and it's an essential tool for understanding the music of video games and films. But in most cases, winter isn't a character. It's more of a topic, something that gets portrayed in different ways across different franchises, platforms, decades, and games. There is no winter motif, no melodic fragment that every composer agrees to use in their winter levels to tie everything together. But there's still a vocabulary to it. There are certain musical features that composers often reach for to communicate that a level takes place somewhere cold. This can be harder to recognize though, because there's no smoking gun. With a leitmotif, it's either there or it isn't. I can play you those two clips of the Imperial March, and you can hear unambiguously that they contain the same melody. If I play you a different Star Wars clip, you can hear that it doesn't, and thus isn't meant to be about Darth Vader. But with a topic as broad as winter, you can't really do that. The music of Star Wars was written mostly by one dude with a centralized singular vision and a clear intentional structure that guided the use of leitmotifs. But hundreds of composers have scored thousands of winter levels for almost 40 years now, and they didn't coordinate. The musical characteristics that make a winter level sound wintry, then, have more to do with an underlying evolving cultural language than with any sort of intentional guiding hand. The problem is that while every composer understands that language, they each understand it differently, and not every game is trying to evoke winter in the same way or for the same reason. Pokemon X's Snowbell City theme isn't telling the same story as Mega Man X's Chill Penguin theme, and yet both pieces clearly sound like winter in their own way. This messy, organic process makes the question of wintry music a perfect one for the field of computational musicology, which takes the tools of modern statistical analysis and uses them to do music theory. If, instead of trying to pick out the connections ourselves, we just take a large dataset of wintry level themes, label them as thoroughly and meticulously as possible, and then let a computer do the rest of the work, what kinds of features wind up being the most significant? And by we, of course, I mean Drs. Megan Lavengood and Evan Williams, who did that. I wasn't involved. I just read the paper. It's a good paper, though. Let's talk about it. If we want to get good data, we need to start by asking what exactly a winter level is. Strictly speaking, winter is a season, the time of year marked by short days and cold weather. But while some video game themes, like Persona 3's Memories of the City, are tied to specific times of year within the game, others, like Donkey Kong Country's Ice Cave Chant, are are just in cold places. For the purposes of this analysis, though, we're going to treat those as the same thing. If there's snow on the ground, it's a winter level. With enough data, we could maybe try to tease out the difference between time-based and location-based cold music, but for the most part, winter is just a convenient name for the collection of aesthetic signifiers that tell players to expect ice physics. Actually, that's an important point. Winter levels tend to involve a lot of specific mechanics. These vary by genre, but for example, in platformers, surfaces tend to be slippery, and in RPGs, monsters have moves that slow down your combat speed. These traditional winter mechanics increase the complexity and the difficulty, so winter levels tend to happen later on in the game once the player knows how things normally work. They also tend to be very striking visually, full of bright whites and pale blues that set them apart from the rest of the world. As such, we need to draw a distinction between winter levels, like Ocarina of Time's Ice Cavern, which temporarily introduce wintry themes to change things up, and winter games, like The Long Dark, Ice Climber, or Frostpunk, which are just wintry throughout. In those cases, the winteriness of a particular level isn't something that requires musical emphasis. It's always there, and the music has more important things to tell you. So while you might think that winter games would be a treasure trove of relevant musical data, we can actually learn a lot more from games where the winter level is an outlier, so this is going to be the only time in this video you'll hear me mention Skyrim. Sorry. With that out of the way, let's talk about the study's approach, because computational musicology is neat and I never get the chance to talk about it. The first step is, of course, to collect a bunch of winter level themes. In total, the authors gathered 160 themes covering a broad range of platforms, publishers, genres, and decades, with games spanning from 1987 to 2020. Next, they went through each of those songs and tagged them with over 100 distinct labels, looking for things like instrumentation, time signature, texture, production, and vibe. And this highlights an important point. Despite all the fancy statistic stuff they did afterwards, the heart of their process was extremely subjective. And that's fine, that's how music theory works, all analysis is subjective. But it's important to keep in mind that the results here aren't necessarily showing us the most common techniques in winter level themes, they're showing us the most common techniques that the authors thought to look for. Like, the majority of the tags they used seem to be about orchestration and accompaniment, with very little dedicated to melodic or harmonic structures beyond identifying the scale. Is that reasonable? Sure, but as 8-Bit Music Theory demonstrates in his video on Christmassy Mario themes, link in the description, melody can also play a role in conjuring that Christmassy sound we so often associate with winter levels. Not including melodic features, either because the authors didn't think they were important or because they were simply too hard to quantify, means that whatever contribution they make won't show up in the final analysis. And to be clear, I'm not criticizing the authors here. This is a point they themselves made in their paper, and it's an essential part of doing good computational musicology. You have to recognize that no matter how thorough the tags are, they still require human judgment, and different humans judge things differently. That's what makes art fun. Anyway, after cleaning up the data, they were left with about 75 tags that showed up often enough to be worth looking at, and from there it was just a matter of doing a bunch of statistical analysis. They described that process in detail in their paper, link in the description if you want to check that out, but the important part for us is that they wound up with a cluster of 9 closely related and very common tags that seem to form the core identity of a winter level. Many songs in the dataset featured most, if not all, of these characteristics, implying that a level theme that did them all would probably fit perfectly over snowy gameplay. But not all data is created equal, and not all of the tags are actually as important as these results imply. For instance, the second most common tag in the entire collection was the time signature 4/4. And sure, most winter level themes are in 4, but so are most other level themes. So is most Western music. 4/4 is such a common time signature that we literally call it common time. The fact that it shows up so often here reflects a much broader societal trend, not an interesting fact about winter themes. After eliminating that and a couple other false positives, the authors were left with 5 tags that seemed to actually be important. The first of these, showing up in over 80% of winter themes, is heavy reverb. In Metroid Prime's Phendrana Drifts, you can really hear all the space created by that wash of reverb. This is probably a way of reflecting the physical environment. Many winter levels take place in caves and mountains, areas famous for their echoes, and even in more traditional outdoor spaces, removing soft leaves and vegetation and replacing them with hard sheets of ice creates a much more reverberant soundscape. And this goes back a long way. One of the oldest tracks in the dataset, Mega Man's Iceman stage from 1987, has some pretty clear reverb on it. But that's strange. The NES sound chip couldn't do reverb. All it had for notes were 3 tone channels which could only generate basic waveforms. In order to create a convincing sense of reverb then, they had to completely dedicate one of those channels to copying another one with a couple milliseconds delay. That's a huge sacrifice. Only being able to play 3 notes at a time was already extremely restrictive for composers. Going down to 2 meant giving up even more textural options just for a simple production effect. The fact that Mega Man composer Manami Matsume decided that trade-off was worth it speaks volumes about the importance of reverb in capturing the sound of winter. Hey, Editing Corey here. It occurs to me that I should probably mention that other parts of the Iceman theme do abandon the reverb in favor of a third melodic voice. That's a limitation of this particular study design. There's no real way to differentiate between something that happens occasionally and something that happens consistently. Don't get me wrong, Iceman's reverb is extremely significant, but in other cases it can be a little difficult to interpret raw numbers when a brief decorative effect in one song is categorized the same way as a foundational element of another. It's the cost of having simple binary data. Not a bad thing, but again, worth keeping in mind that all of this is subjective, and what counts as what is ultimately a matter of human judgment, not cold hard facts. At the end of the day, this is still music theory, so we're still just making things up. The second important tag, showing up in over 60% of winter themes, is arpeggiated accompaniment. In Undertale's Snowden Town, you can hear the string part arpeggiating a chord progression in a call and response figure with a glockenspiel, while in Nappletail's Snowball, there's a constant arpeggiating figure sitting underneath the melody. And this is, again, interesting from a technological perspective. With only 3 tone channels on those early sound chips, if you wanted to have a bass line and a melody, then you only had one voice left for harmony, making arpeggios almost mandatory. And while sound technology has advanced a lot since the 80s, arpeggiated accompaniments are still part of the DNA of video game music, and you see them often in all sorts of different themes, especially in retro games. Like with 4.4, it's important not to just uncritically accept what the data is saying, so while these arpeggios are very common, that doesn't make them quite as strong an indicator of winter as you might expect. Still, arpeggios have historically been used to evoke ideas like falling rain, or in this case snow, and rapid arpeggios can give the music a shimmering quality reminiscent of the blinding white atmosphere of a pristine snowfield, so while this effect is common in other kinds of video game music, I think it's still fair to say it signifies winter, especially when combined with other characteristics. This is also connected with our third tag, plucked strings. This could be a harp like in Final Fantasy Tactics Antidote, orchestral strings like in Ukulele's Glitterglaze Glacier, or even a guitar like in Hero of Leaf Valley's winter theme. These examples tend to come from later games once the technology was capable of rendering actual instrument sounds. In something like Hanjuku Hero's Winter Field theme, it doesn't make much sense to talk about orchestration. It's all blatantly synthetic. But once instruments became a part of the equation, plucked strings quickly established themselves as an essential component of the winter sound. But if we want to talk winter instruments, the most iconic has to be our fourth tag, metallic percussion. You're probably familiar with the trope of using sleigh bells, like in Kingdom Hearts 2's Christmas Town, and yeah, this is very common. Sleigh bells alone showed up in over 25% of the sampled themes, and they're often joined by other metallic percussion sounds like chimes, cymbals, and tambourines. These also coincide with our final tag, missing drums. That is, the metallic percussion typically replaces rather than augmenting standard drum sounds, and non-metallic percussion is pretty rare. The only exception is that full rock drum kits do still show up regularly, like in Castle Crasher's Winter Bliss, but they tend to be less associated with other wintry sounds. Notice how Winter Bliss also lacks plucked strings or any significant metallic percussion, making it not the best candidate for an archetypal winter theme in the first place. So even if not every winter theme does this, the ones that are the most wintry by other measures also tend to avoid non-metallic drums, making it a solid indicator of a strong wintry sound. But metallic percussion runs deeper than that, and it isn't restricted to the percussion section. We also hear metallophones take on melodic roles, most often via the glockenspiel. You've already heard it in a bunch of examples throughout this video, but to add one more to the pile, here's Bravely Default's Land of Immortality. Metal instruments tend to sound cold, crisp, bright, and hollow compared to more common melodic instruments like the piano, violin, or flute, making them perfect musical stand-ins for the feeling of winter. So there you have it. If you want your level theme to feel like winter, just add a bunch of reverb, arpeggiate the harmony with some plucked strings, play the melody on a glockenspiel, leave out the drums, and maybe add some sleigh bells to be safe. But what's interesting to me about this study isn't just the results, it's the method. It feels to me like a proof of concept, and it demonstrates a couple important things. First, it's making the case for doing topic theory to video game music, and this seems like a no-brainer to me. The big challenge of topic theory is connecting the sounds you're hearing with the aesthetics they represent, and video games are chock full of non-musical information that make it extremely clear what they're trying to evoke. It's not hard to tell that a song was written as a desert theme when the level it plays over takes place in a desert. But the study also suggests a new way to do that research using the tools of computational musicology. And the exciting thing there is that it allows for cross-comparison. By standardizing tags across different kinds of level themes, you can really get a sense of which techniques belong to which environments. Remember, we threw out 4/4 but kept the arpeggios, despite both of them being common across video game music in general, because it felt right to say that arpeggios still had wintry vibes. But if we ran the same experiment on like 5 different sets of level themes, comparing winter levels to, say, one set in forests, deserts, underwater, or in outer space, we could remove the guesswork and see for sure how common each element is in different settings. Maybe 4/4 is particularly common in winter levels, or maybe it's unusually rare. Seems unlikely, but without checking, it's hard to say for sure. So I'd love to see more studies with people taking this framework and applying it to different kinds of themes, and not just to figure out what those environments sound like on their own. All these different topics often exist side by side within the same games, so building a larger, more interconnected dataset means figuring out how composers understand and evoke entire worlds. Plus, it's an excuse to listen to a lot of really cool themes. That's a nice bonus. Anyway, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Kevin Wilamowski, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Damien Fuller-Sutherland, and Jon Hancock. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.